Welcome to Conflict Managed. I'm your host, Mary Brown. Conflict Managed is a weekly podcast about toxic work environments and how to fix them. We're glad you're here. Good morning, Benjamin, and welcome to Conflict Managed.
Good morning.
I know we're going to have a really interesting conversation, and I've taken a look at your new book. It looks fabulous. But before we get into that and how you got into writing, how you ended up writing this book and what's in it, I would like to hear about the first job you ever had as a young person.
Well, that would be me being a dishwasher. Not that I'm trying to copy Jason Wong, but Jason Wong, but I think when I was in high school and I think around like just 15 and a half, it was kind of like on the borderline of being able to be officially. And a friend of mine had this gig as a dishwasher at this really nice French restaurant, and so he said, "Look, I've got to go to military service." And he's doing something, and he said, "Why don't you take my spot?" My first job, I had a little moped at the time that I go over there, and it was a gig for they did dinners, so I get there before they started. I think I want to say like around 4:30 ish, something like that, and everybody would be rushing inside. It was a small kind of venue, and they would be prepping. And I remember so distinctly my first day, my first night. It was so intense because as a dishwasher in a small confined space, a commercial dishwasher, there's all this steam, and you're trying to, use the washer and you're cleaning everything. And what I didn't realize was they use the same service of dishes twice through that rotation. So there's real pressure. There's not like you have like extra inventory of cups and dishes and stuff. You don't. And so I turned on, as I was doing it, I remember having to go outside in the back, and I was literally throwing up from the intensity of it. Like it came all at once.
Mhm.
And that was my first job. And after that, of course, it was great. I learned a lot about working with a group of people, in a tight kind of confined space, and everybody's got their job and they're moving very quickly, chef, all that kind of stuff. And I remember how fulfilling it was to be at the end of the day and then to like partake, in some of the extra desserts and stuff, and then have that kind of team camaraderie that you kind of really completed something. And that was so important to me. I remember those things.
Oh, I mean, you've said so many really interesting things, and what a wonderful first experience because the job dishwasher, most people may not think community, being a part of a
Mm,
team,
mm.
being integral, being really feeling that. And like you said, the camaraderie at the end of the night where you're partaking almost literally in the fruits of what you guys have been doing. And I think it's so much it goes to show it has little to do with the job itself and more the people you're doing it with and the ethos and what people expect and how you're treated and how you're treated as this integral part. Because if you're not doing your part, half of the night doesn't have dishes, right? I mean, like it's
Right.
so very important. Um, but also your first day that it was so intense and so stressful, but then you came back.
Oh, yes, yes. I think you realize really quickly that there aren't two dishwashers, right? There's one. And you know that you're part of this group
Yeah,
and they need you,
yeah,
right? So that wasn't an option, you have to get in there and go do it.
yeah. I love that. I just imagine when I think about a healthy work environment, it really is true. We need every single part. Every single part. If we don't need that part, then we need to restructure. Every single part is necessary for the whole to work. And when leaders don't recognize that, when our colleagues don't recognize that, it's more clunky. We have less fulfilling work, less ability to collaborate because we don't feel included. But the truth of it is that we really do need everybody there. We really do need everybody to see how they fit into the whole, individually what they're doing and why it's important, but then how it works, this idea of collegiality, that we all need each other to accomplish whatever task is set in front of us as the group. And so, what a wonderful gift to have that experience for your first job.
It was super important. I learned a lot from that position.
So, where did you go on after your dishwashing days and some of your other first jobs? Where did you land? Where's your first professional job?
Well, I remember having all these different thoughts. When I was in college, I went to USC and I did my my major work in business, international finance. But I always had this deep love of computers. And so, my place was kind of like the dorm room where people would get their term papers printed. And, and I remember, I think coming out of that, I was thinking about, doing this consulting in computers, and I kind of did that a little bit. But the reality is that my first real professional job was working as an IT administrator in a law firm. And it was a large firm that specialized in California on insurance insolvency, and that was the focus. And I remember, there was a group of networking protocols from a company called Novell at the time that was very popular. Maybe think of it as pre-internet, but for connecting companies together. And I was an expert in that type of system and that type of networking. And I was brought in to be the administrator for this LA office. And it was very different in the sense of also kind of like, hey, we're relying on you, right? But now you have a floor of lawyers, paralegals, and staff that are supporting all this litigation. So the job was essentially, processing a lot of paper. And I just remember really some really poignant points of it. It was very professional. So one day I came to work, I had a suit, but I had a white shirt, but no tie. I didn't wear a tie that day. And one of the partners was with me as we were walking into the entrance, and he said to me, "Ben, we don't do pajamas here." And I was just like taken aback a little bit, like, got it. It's you know, because I thought, I am the IT guy, right? So maybe
Right.
I'm going to be underneath desks and routing cable through the ceiling or doing some other things. But the formality of it, right? Like,
Yeah.
we have our culture, our ethos is this,
Mhm.
and so that stuck with me.
Yeah.
I think learning how to work with different levels of folks in the organization was also interesting, right? Because you have the partners, right, that are super busy
Mhm.
and are, on these calls all the time and all that stuff. And then you've got a set of other legal people underneath them that are more actively engaged with your computers. And this was a time when Word Perfect was the de facto
Mhm.
word processing system. Microsoft Word was just coming into its announcement. Um, and so managing files and networking and people calling you when they couldn't connect their modems to the office to get their files back and forth, that required a lot of interesting things because a lot of people were not really tech literate,
Mhm.
right? And so then you're now learning how to troubleshoot over the phone, right? Or work with people directly. And you can't come to another person and say, well, I understand all of this. Why can't you just get this? You're now having to learn how to take something that you want to convey a message, right, to another human being and to do it in such a way that it is non-threatening to them, that it is a way that they can comprehend that information and then move on and feel good about that. And so that kind of, I think of it as, instruction, right? In a world of this constant pressure of needs. I think that understanding of the ethos of that was something that I really took away from that position.
I really like how you explained communication. A lot of times we think communication is I have this piece of information and I'm giving it to you. And a lot of times we don't think about how it lands. We don't think about if they have the same vocabulary or understanding to understand what I'm saying to them in the way that I mean it. But you also talked about how they feel, right? Being
Yes.
gentle with somebody, right? So if somebody feels judged or harassed or hurried or their ability to take in the information is reduced, right? And then especially when it comes to tech, a lot of people can feel inadequate even today, right? So let alone the beginnings of this revolution. And so you've got all this noise, internal noise about I'm not going to get this. This is going to be difficult. I'm going to be seen as incompetent in this particular way and I need to know it. So to be able to not only communicate technical information into finding a way for this person and their frame of reference to understand it, but in a way where they can be receptive and open. That's, real generosity in communication.
Yeah, I think what I found is that for people that are already under stress and then something's just not working for them, right? They can't get the printer to work. They can't
Mhm.
save their file. They can't find their file. They can't figure out how to make the program work. Um, it's really challenging, right, to work with another human being in that moment of this high stress and then say, look, let's take a breath. It's not going to be as bad as you think, right? Let me show you these 4 easy steps, right? I mean, it has to be kind of thought through that way. And every single human being perceives information differently, right? Some people are more visual, some people are more intellectual, some people need to have this, they need to feel it. And it dictates a different strategy or a set of techniques when you're trying to help that person, get that information.
Mhm. As you were talking, I was also thinking like what a lot of us do when technology doesn't work. We get so frustrated, we start banging it, right?
Mm.
Slapping the printer on the side or you know, in this, in if we could step back and see that's not probably going to get what you want. It could make it worse, right? But these visual signs, when people get frustrated, a lot of times, even the most mild person can like physically take it out on technology, which I just think it's really interesting about how to communicate with somebody who is escalated, right? So somebody who, if we think about conflict or something else that's going on, many times they're in a heightened state, and they're already having all of these emotions at the forefront. Instead of someone who's just in a way cool and calm and detached and in the best kind of way, right? You're not just shooting the breeze with somebody, but when somebody's actively in a stressful situation, the way that you communicate with that person is just wholly different.
Yes, yes, it's not too indifferent than being like a pilot of an aircraft.
Mm.
When the problem has arisen, right? You know, calm is fast.
Right. I love that. Calm is best. So you mentioned that you majored in business,
Mm.
finance, business, international business, but you
Yes,
got interested in you were always interested in computers.
yes.
So how did you where did you go next, or how did you decide to do one versus the other?
So I ended up being, I continuing on this technology track. And, what ended up happening is I went from there, this law firm, ultimately to a company that you might recognize, CBS, the broadcaster. And they have a facility, which I still think is there in North Los Angeles in Van Nuys. And it was a large production facility, which means it had many sound stages. So a lot of those, shows like Roseanne, Grace Under Fire, all that stuff was Seinfeld was being shot there. Um, and it was a very large facility, 40 acres. And they were looking for someone to basically kind of convert it from its mainframe operations to PC-based operations and to basically kind of upscale the entire lot. And so I had gotten the job to run that facility. And it was interesting. It was an interesting time. There were companies like, I think, if I remember correctly, Netscape was one of the first internet companies that had made a browser
Mhm.
for the internet. And they had gone public, I want to say, like in 94, 96, I think, something around that time. And I was already at CBS and I had already done all of this work. And I was, Pacific Bell, or you can think of it as, Verizon's first customer, commercial customer in California to bring the internet to the facility. So I was already experimenting with a lot of things. And, what happened was that I had a really good friend of mine that was finishing his MBA from Chicago. And we were started talking. And it was a lot of like, well, this internet thing is becoming really interesting. Maybe we should start an internet company. And so we ended up doing that. We raised money. We went to San Francisco of all places, right? And we started up one of the first companies, a company called Iron Light Digital, that basically made websites for corporate customers. And that's kind of how that journey went. And I continued to be in this entrepreneurial, you know, mostly chief technology officer, chairman, CEO kind of role throughout a number of companies in this arc, you know, rooted first in this kind of internet technology, ultimately moving into, cloud-based systems, content-based systems, consumer electronics type products, moving into more industrial commercial products, all along this arc. And it's just been an incredible journey, of just learning, interfacing, and seeing the evolution of technology with what's happened so far.
Well, when I think about change and work with organizations that have change management or however you want to think about change, the kind of change that you have been through with technology, it just sounds so interesting. I imagine you've never arrived at a point and then you're done because the next wave and the next wave comes and
Mm.
comes. How have you, as a leader, helped people deal with the change in a fruitful way? Or the people that you've surrounded yourself, they by nature are evolving with the technology.
Well, I think that irrespective of the technology at hand or what you're doing, I feel like the the fundamentals, um, the core tenets of having a team of people that you're working with, you know, the people that you're delivering services to or products to, your outside partners that you're working with. I think all of that fundamentally, it's really the same. And what I mean by that is, you know, when I finished my last gig and I kind of started really retiring at this stage, um, you know, I had done something I'd never done before. I was brought in by this family, of all things in lighting business, to build, new lines of business for them. And at that time, I didn't really have a good understanding of lighting per se. There are many different types of commercial fixtures, different shapes and sizes, um, different requirements in every state, electrical requirements. And yet, I felt very comfortable taking the assignment. They said, look, we want you to go to a foreign country. We want you to set up shop We want you to make these products. We want you to bring those products back to the United States, and then we want to basically sell them, right? They had a very strong business already. They'd already been in business for 70 years and had already built up other lines of business successfully. But they realized that their only option was either to buy an existing business that had that full line of business already developed, or to do it from scratch.
Mhm.
And if to do it from scratch was a very much an entrepreneurial approach, right? It was something that needed to be done rapidly because you couldn't compete with just, like if you were thinking about like a set of tools, for instance, if you just had, five sizes of socket wrenches, but you didn't have the full breadth, right? You can't go into that market. You have to have them all,
Right, right.
right? So the real challenge was building an entire portfolio of products and launching them all at once.
Mhm.
So, and this turned out to be the largest electrical products launch in US history at that time. But what I mean by the basics are is I kind of done all of that work, and then I just took a breather for a second, and I thought to myself, okay, I always use the same things, right? I always use these principles of thinking, of operating. And then I thought to myself, how did I come up with these principles? Right. And that's why Lessons from the Mat was born. It was really something like, because I had so many people come to me and say, hey, Ben, my son Joe's just graduating college. He's thinking about doing this startup. Do you think you and, could spend an hour or two at lunch with him and just talk to him about it? It would be really, we really love that. And I realized that I had this kind of operating manual, maybe a set of a framework, a way of thinking about things, and it was the same. It didn't matter what I was doing. I'd already internalized an approach, and I just applied this approach to everything that I was doing, right? And I realized that a lot of that approach had come from, you know, my work, my training in the martial arts, right? And I started realizing, oh, okay, this I'm doing over here is connected here, and this is, and so it's one whole thing. It's one way of thinking, one way of approaching something, and in the problem solving, when you're in a combat scenario, if you want to think of it that way, right, in a hand-to-hand engagement with another human being, it's very similar to problem solving in a corporate business personal life environment. It's the same root core principles.
Yeah.
And so that's what I would say to you is that, you know, I think going to school, being in a corporate environment, and being in so many different scenarios has empowered me or allowed me to find the right words or language or cultural interfacing with other human beings in that particular situation.
Mm.
Right. So I have this framework, but then coupled with that, I do have the wisdom, the knowledge that I've gained from these other experiences, like being the dishwasher, right, that have allowed me to really use these principles in a more scalable way.
Mm. So your book is called Lessons from the Mat, the 12 Martial Art Principles that will help you succeed in business and in life. I love a good principle. I love a scaffolding that is transferable. And sometimes, if you just have a sort of these mono experiences and you've only been in one field and seen and dealt with those kinds of issues, it can be the scaffolding that you have can be skewed because you're only looking at this one particular way. But I love that you talk about not only your variety of business experiences, but that it's coming from your martial arts background. I think coupled, those two things coupled together, make for a very interesting and I'm sure practical way of thinking independent of the situation you find yourself in.
Yeah, look, I've been training for over 43 years now in the martial arts, and I've done that under multiple disciplines, whether it's been Tae Kwon Do, Hapkido, or Brazilian Jiu Jitsu. And the principles, the thinking, the problem solving, I've realized it's all the same. So like for instance, the first principle in my book, right? It's not necessarily linear, but it is the first one that I talk about. It's the notion of stillness, and I call it having a stillness muscle. And what I mean by that is that a problem comes, and oftentimes our first thought process is, "Oh, I just need to react to the problem," right? And that's great that you do that, but I've found it oftentimes is more efficient or more effective to just have a moment to kind of have an ability to see what is really in front of me. Because it takes a moment sometimes. Something comes in front of you, and it's like, well, is this life or death? What's the gravity or the magnitude or the weight of this specific thing? And then you can kind of evaluate it on its own merits and kind of just say, oh, this is what's in front of me now. Okay. And then you can say, okay, what is my set of resources? What do I have to engage in this conversation with this issue? And I think by having that versus being reactive, one can be, you know, proactive to say, right? You can actually just be in a place where you have decided, you have had a thought, you are now going to engage on your own terms versus on what's happened and just trying to, have this gut reacting instinct, which is oftentimes driven by, unfortunately, a fear that you had when you were 5 years old. I mean, it gives you a moment, a pause, a breath. And so I like to think that, breathing is a way to help. But it is this notion of just clearing your mind just for a moment and then say, what is in front of me? And what is my relationship to this problem or this issue? And now what is my appropriate response?
I love that so much because we do hear and you should respond instead of react. Okay, fine, great. For a lot of the reasons you laid out, I don't want to just react. But then the question is how? And this idea of a stillness muscle, because we think about reacting, you're just doing it, right? You're coming at it. But if it's a muscle, it's something you've developed, something that you can hold you in place, right? Uh,
Yes.
and to be able to be still, to be able to be quiet, giving you room for curiosity for all the things that you've said. Why should we think that we should just be able to do it if we haven't developed that skill or worked intentionally on that skill? And so instead of working on not reacting, it's hard to do. We can work on silence or being still and think, I'm developing this capacity. And if you intentionally try to develop a capacity, you're more likely to have it. And now all of a sudden you have this room and this space to respond in a way that is in step with your values, or as you've said, to evaluate the severity or what the situation and what is the appropriate response given what is coming at me instead of the reacting. And many times people just feel held captive. Well, I'm just going to react. Well, there are things that we can do. And I just love that so much, thinking about that as a muscle, something to develop, something that can hold us instead of we just are loose and we are hostage to our emotional responses or our fears or our worries, but being able to develop that.
Yeah, so I remember so poignantly, and I write about this in my book, in this chapter. You know, one of my instructors, this old Korean master, his name was Grandmaster Kang. You know, one day after our class, he turned to me and he said, "Hey, Ben, um, do you meditate?" And of course, I knew what meditation was, right? And I maybe attempted or done it, or participated a couple times, but it wasn't like, I'm not doing that every day. I mean, that takes too much time. It's too much effort. I'm busy. Um, and I kind of gave some of those reasons, like I'm busy, I understand it kind of thing. And he looked at me with these eyes, and he's an old soul, this guy. He had fought in wars, and he had, was a priest at a temple, I mean, all these things, right? And he looked at me again and he said, "Look, do you have 2 minutes a day?" What was I going to say to that? I was like, "Yeah, yeah, of course I have 2 minutes a day." And he said, "Okay, just meditate 2 minutes a day." And I did take that to heart, right? It was like, okay, challenge accepted, right? 2 minutes a day, So what ended up happening is I woke up in the morning, and it wasn't like I needed to set an additional time or whatever. It was 2 minutes, and I just said, okay, I'm just going to, try to meditate. It's so hard to clear your mind in the beginning, but I just went through the motion, and I did my best, and 2 minutes ultimately became 3, 4, 5, and eventually, 15, 30 minutes. And now every morning when I wake up, I spend about 30 minutes in the morning with a specific breathing and meditation practice. But I can tell you, even the 2 minutes was helpful. And what I noticed was that as things were flying at me throughout the day, it was kind of weird. It was just like, okay, well, maybe I'm just going to take a second to pause. And I taught myself this comfort of basically getting these little pauses. And so then I realized it's like a muscle.
Yeah.
It was just like a little muscle that I was building. And the real difference here, Mary, is about the intentionality of it. Is that you are taking ownership. You are intentionally deciding to do something. And you're intentionally deciding to do something that is consistent. And it is this kind of, not only you're building the silence muscle, but you are reinforcing the confidence in yourself that you can do this over and over and over again, whatever it ends up being.
Mhm. Gosh, I love all of that. And I love this word comfort, right? A lot of times I think something like meditation, or how do I get to the state, or whatever a good habit I want. It just seems so difficult to get. It's going to require me holding it together. It's just difficult, and especially I think when you first start meditating, it's all this, everything comes at you, this cacophony. But to think about it as a comfort, I think is really beautiful. And to think that there's this ability to trust ourselves, to be able to trust ourselves, whatever circumstance comes up, has a lot to do with how we're training our responses, how we train the ability to sit in discomfort, the ability to let somebody else have a point of view, or whatever it might be, but allow it, thinking that difficulty will be around the corner and how are we going to show up. But this idea that training myself, developing the virtue or the habit of pausing as being a real comfort, not only just to be able to rest the mind and maybe even the muscles in our face and how tense we get. So we can think about physical comfort, mental comfort, but that pause of who am I? How am I showing up? And that I can trust how I'm going to be showing up instead of just at the whim of whatever emotions come over me.
Yes. It's a core fundamental building block,
Mm,
right? It's kind of like from here, you can go anywhere,
mm.
right? It's a seed.
I like that so much. When you think about your career and all the different places you have been, how did you deal with conflict, a conflict at work, like maybe with someone who's either a peer or someone that reported to you, or somebody at work? How did you deal with it when your younger self, and then as you have matured and maybe one of the last jobs you've had, how has it changed for you?
I think, unfortunately, as a younger version of me, um, any kinds of things that were conflicts that came, ultimately, I felt attacked my ego so badly that I had to overreact.
Mm,
And this was probably, it's still a lifelong kind of lesson, but or learning. But when I was younger, I had to deal with the 5-year-old child, all the fears, all these things that were, clouding or influencing, right, my response or my reaction. And, to be quite frank, that those things came out poorly, and I I think so much now about, the importance of a leader when you're with other folks and being able to be as much as you can making decisions without this 5-year-old ego involved, right? Or call it a 40, 50-year-old ego. The reality of it is that I find that that's perhaps one of the most important things that a leader can do is to leave the ego right off the mat. And that's what I like about martial arts is, you have people from all walks of life. But when they first come on the mat to learn a new martial art, it doesn't matter that they're a football player. It doesn't matter that they're the CEO of a company. It doesn't matter that they're the secretarial pool person. They're all equal. And I think when you're leading a team, it's super important because once you are able to leave your ego aside for a moment, I like to say put it on a shelf, right? It allows you as a leader to be more open, more able to connect, with your people in a real meaningful way. And, versus, like a disaster would happen, right? In early days, and oh my gosh, you yell, scream, emotions, it's the end of the world, whatever. Versus now, if something happens among the team and a mistake has occurred, oh my gosh, we made the wrong product that had the wrong specifications. We're going to have to destroy all those products and make them again. Cost money, cost time. Okay. It happens, right? We understand that was accidental. It wasn't intentional. Everybody was working their best efforts. What can we learn from this? And, that's not worry about doing it. That's move forward. And if you are a leader that can embrace that your team can feel comfortable to come to you. Oh, I don't know. Ben's gonna really be upset about this. And yet they, the leader can still embrace you. Like, you know what? You're not gonna. Your child made a mistake. Are you gonna destroy your child over that? You're not, right? Of course, only a parent would understand that maybe, but you're building a team. The team has to know that it is in an environment that is supportive of them to grow.
Mhm.
And so that stands, I think, almost above everything else. Above, you know, I'm maybe I'm not the Elon Musk style of management, but I'm more about wanting to make sure the team is always fully aligned and happy and able to function because I fundamentally believe that that's more important or as important as the profit margin result. I mean, it's you kind of as a CEO, you're managing those two items,
Mhm.
right? You have the outside, shareholders, people that gnawing at you, and you have your inside family, and you kind of ride the middle of that, right? You're the shield from this to this, and vice versa. So I would tell you it's significant the difference when I was younger to now, and there are many painful lessons, painful learnings that I, have regrets of how I might have treated certain people or reacted appropriately or done certain things. But I also, don't regret, having the opportunity to have learned those things. And you also learn this when you're teaching people on the mat, right? They're there to learn. You're there to help guide them to grow, right? If they make one small mistake and then you just like say, "Oh, you're the dumbest person,"
Right.
they're not going to be there very long.
Right. So what shifted in you? Was it just, we have experiences, we all make mistakes, but we don't all learn from them. So in your own growth in dealing with conflict and difficulties at work and disappointments and mistakes, is there something that shifted in you, or was it a slow process?
Hmm. There are several, well, that's a really good question. I've had, I would say my executive coaching had, you know, um, I think for over a decade, maybe a decade and a half, I was lucky enough to have, great mentors or coaches around me, right? In very active participation,
Mhm.
right? So, and so that kind of helped me understand, what was driving my reactions or my decision process, and they understood, venture capital type businesses. So they were able to relate with the pressures of the board and those aspects as well as internally, as well as trying to go after customers with some product or service you're building. And having that ability to have a sounding board, right? Another person that I respected, that I could have this engagement with, I think that was probably the most pivotal for me, of having another coach, if you will, be with me for a long part of the journey.
I really appreciate that because this is a thread we haven't pulled on, but you've mentioned it several times about the teacher, the trainer, the now the coach, that whether you're on the mat and you're helping people learn and grow and develop these particular skills, could you learn something from watching a video? Sure, but you're not going to learn it in the same kind of way. Having people speak into our lives who know us, who know the lay of the land, so that we can trust them, that we can trust their voice, and that we can hear what they have to say about us because they're there to help us get better, and we believe that, and we have reason to believe that. And this idea that we all need help. We all need somebody else's perspective. Not that that other person's always right, but this idea that if we just try to do this life alone, if we just try to only see from our own perspective, it's going to be skewed. If we could take advantage of and reach out and learn and really be open to what other people have to say and what they see about us so that we can get better. It does seem like a life hack, a shortcut, in a way um, that can be painful because it is, most of us, we're doing what we're doing because we think it's the right thing to do. If we didn't think it was the right thing to do, we do something else. But we only see what we can see. And if we have somebody else and we can borrow their insight, um, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's one of the interesting parts about martial arts, I guess, is what I would say is, when you come onto the mat, you get to the truth telling process very quickly, right? Because you can't hide that you can't do the punch or the grip or the hold or the movement correctly, right? There's no fuzziness about that. It's evident, it's right there. And so it does take a certain kind of, you know, that's probably for many people that first start, right? That's a big apprehension.
Mhm.
I'm going to go someplace and people are going to see me naked, in a sense.
Yeah.
And I think with executive coaching, it's very similar to that. It's kind of like you're going to have this truth telling process ever so gently, right? Um, and and I think and that can only be done with another person. And I think that's one of the refreshing parts about an engagement, like a sport, for instance. When you're on the court, when you're doing at the driving range, whatever you're doing, it's right there. It's gonna like you can't hide that the ball didn't make it to the place. It's like and it's very much the same in life and in business, right? The mistakes occur, and the drivers. I mean, it's so there is. I don't use that word in my book, but I liken it to that there is a truth telling process,
Mhm.
and I think you go through these different stages, like where you kind of realize, okay, what is the truth to begin with?
Mhm.
Now that we have agreement on what that is,
Mhm.
right? You know, what does that now mean?
Yeah.
And that dictates everything else. It
Mhm.
dictates, what skills, what your gap analysis is, what
Mhm.
things you need to do, how much homework you need to do on these parts, you know, and it provides the foundational process for everything else.
It can be hard to get to that in the messiness and the fuzziness of human relations because this idea of how we want others to perceive us, how we want to perceive ourselves, um, yeah, the kind of hiding that we do from ourselves, living in denial. And then somebody else is also doing this, and we've got these people, and we're further along or not as far along when it comes to our own development, emotional intelligence, what we can see. And even if we all in good faith are going to the same place, it isn't, as you said, the gift of you could do it, you can't do it, right? You can shoot, you're not, you can do the move, you can't do the move. Um, and so it's this art and this dance. But I think if you have the desire to for authenticity and to be to show up in work and in life as an authentic self, whatever that means. I mean, I think that needs unpacking. What does that mean for me to know myself?
Sure, sure.
And that's complicated, but having people outside to help us. My husband has a spiritual director and has for a while, and I admire that so much that you would put yourself in that vulnerable position because it shows such a real desire to want to be better, to live out your principles, to recognize that we need that kind of intimate help for someone who we respect is going on this path in which you want to be going down.
Yeah, you brought up a word, the notion of being authentic, right? I think to be the coach, to be the leader, it is by far the most important aspect is that you as a leader by default understand who you are and then by default, making sure that your actions basically are reflective of that, that then provides the consistency of the behavior and the actions that allows for the trust that can be formed in the group, right? Because if you don't have authenticity, essentially, right, the first moment your behavior spikes or changes in some weird angle, that's the moment when the trust completely erodes. And then all of a sudden, your team is now not cohesive because they're second guessing. Is this really our mission? Right? Does he really believe that? Or did, you know, and, and that I call it slack in the system, right? That inefficiency in today's competitive world, could be the difference between being number one or not making it.
Yeah. And when we think about change, we have external change of markets change, new technologies, but what should be consistent is behavior. What does it mean to not only be civil, but to cooperate well, to collaborate, that I can have consistent behavior from my colleagues and my leaders, that somebody's not yelling one day and, speaking out of two sides of their mouth. So there's external change, but if we want to help people navigate that, because that's never going away, if we can give them internal stability when it comes to character, how we show up, and in doing that in a consistent way, and of course, and being able to deal with the mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes. Everybody does things they wish they hadn't, but being able to that sense of integrity, right? So I trust you because I see that you have this track, this way of being, and that kind of consistency that doesn't change, um, is, I think, going to really help people make it through whatever new product, whatever new bump, whatever new war, whatever erupts around us, around the world, shifting in our own markets.
Yeah. And I think that's also the attraction, right? People come onto the mat to learn a skill, right? To be part of a journey. Um, they want they've come there to have faith, right? In a process, a set of mentors, right? They come there for that.
Mhm.
And so, I think of you know, the way the ultimate responsibility of leadership, rests in this kind of zone. And then by being the example, that then helps other people reconcile what they need to do so that they then too can be an example.
Mhm. Absolutely. Well, gosh, this time has really gotten away from me. I have one last question for you.
Sure.
As you look into the future of work, what do you think needs to happen so that not only will all workers be treated with dignity and respect, but that they'll be encouraged to thrive and flourish?
Well, look, I think the contract that you have, right, the agreement that you should have with your team, with people that, it's really about a journey that we're taking together. What I tell people that come on board a startup, for instance, if you think of a traditional venture capital startup, the ratio has always been quite bad in the sense of, out of 10 companies that get funded that are going after an idea, right? These 10 boats go out into the ocean and their job is to go find the island with the coconuts. And the reality is that 7 of those boats are going to get washed out at sea. You're going to completely evaporate, die. You're not going to make it. All right. 2 of the boats might break even, and 1 boat might actually make it. And so you've got a team of people on each of these boats, smartest, brilliant minds, right? Young, you know, graduates that are, it's like a lot of, you've got the best of the best, right? that are being hired into these things. And what I always tell people up front is I said, look, there's a 70% chance that we're not going to make it. I'm letting you know that now. That's just the reality of it. Yeah, I believe that I'm really smart. I believe that we're really well capitalized. I believe that we have great partners, etc. But that's the reality. But what I will promise you is that if you come on this boat, that I will always tell you where we are. You will always be part of the process. You will know when I know, right? And it's a learning, growing process. So I liken it to my responsibility is to make sure that everybody in the group is moving forward and growing, right? And I think that's what the contract is. I think that's what the agreement should be. So when I look at it from that macro view of how we should treat people, right? It basically relates to every aspect of that.
As you were speaking, I was going back to what you said about being the dishwasher and how it felt and being on a team. And I think it doesn't matter what field you're in, but how you feel being at work and transparency, trust in your leaders because they're telling you what's going on and they uh, bring so much so that people are free to be their best selves. They are free to do their work. Um, yeah, we definitely need more of that. You tell adults what's going on, tell them the truth, and it makes everything better.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, Ben, thank you so much. And thank you for writing this wonderful book. I've already downloaded it and I can't wait to start reading it. Lessons from the
Yeah.
Mat, the 12 martial art
Yeah.
principles that will help you succeed in business and in life.
And this book is already, has been a bestseller on Amazon in multiple categories several times. So it's a short read, and quite frankly, I wrote it for my daughter, you
Mm.
know, because I wanted to leave her. Kept thinking to myself, what are the most important things in my life? If I were to distill them, would I give to somebody as a manual?
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, and thank you for this wonderful conversation.
All right.
Take care.
Thanks.
Ben, thank you so much for your work, for writing this book, and a thoughtful conversation. Conflict Manage is produced by third-party workplace conflict restoration services and hosted by me, Mary Brown. You can find us online at 3pconflictrestoration.com. Come back, we have new episodes every Tuesday. And if you would like and subscribe wherever you are listening or watching this podcast, it's much appreciated. My latest book, which is called Winning the Generation Wars at Work, Making Your Age an Asset, is available on Amazon. Our music is courtesy of Dove Pilot. And remember, conflict is normal and expected. Let's deal with it. Until next time, take care.